assets. Welcome and a very good afternoon to all the students present for this session of business law, the 8th session of business law, where we are going to deal with the Foreign Exchange Management Act, FEMA 1999. Friends, before we move to the details of this Foreign Exchange Management Act, just going through the background of this, FEMA, this Foreign Management Exchange Act, was evolved from an earlier version of the Act where we set the Act to be Foreign Exchange Regulation Act 1972. Now, with the transformation that we witnessed in Indian economy, where Indian economy got liberalized in the year 1992 and 93, and subsequently there were many such changes that we witnessed in the external trade and practices, which of course has to be regularized to make the orderly development of Indian economy. And that is the reason why this Foreign Exchange Management Act was enacted in the year 1999. The basic objective of this act is to consolidate and amend all those laws related to control the foreign exchanges and to facilitate the external trade affairs, the payments related to the external trades, and for promoting the orderly development of this foreign exchange market in India. The basic objective is to regularize the Indian economy when the economy was opened up to the entire globe. However, there are many such chapters in this act, but we are going to discuss some of the important provisions of this particular act, where we need to understand who is a person called as the resident in India and the person resident out of India. Here we need to discuss it in detail with all those confusions that you need to have between this person resident in India and citizens of India. That has to be removed. Similarly, how these transactions in relation to the foreign exchanges, like the capital account transactions, the current account transactions, are being conducted in India through or being regulated through this act. We are going to discuss that. Similarly, export of these goods and services, the transfer of immovable property out of India by the persons resident in India or by the persons resident out of India, how these are the things that has been conducted or controlled, regulated by FEMA. We are going to discuss that. Dealing with all those foreign exchanges, foreign securities, and what are the penalties that are to be considered while dealing with all these enactments, right? All those people who are following all of those rules and regulations. Those are the important aspects of this act that we are going to discuss in between. So broadly, if I'll say that this Foreign Exchange Management Act has 4 such important aspects. When we talk of the first such important aspect, we say it's the transactions related to the current account, right? And what are the restrictions that are imposed for this current account transactions we need to talk of. Similarly, whenever we talk of these transactions, what are the aspects related to this capital account transactions and the realization of this export proceedings, right? We need to talk of that. Dealing with foreign exchanges, like who can be the authorized person to deal with all of such foreign exchanges. We are going to discuss that. And similarly, what sort of provisions are there, like when we do talk of this adjudication of offenses, right? And any kind of appeal or provisions related to the appeal is there, if at all we need to talk of it. So this FEMA Act is broadly divided into four such different aspects. What we are going to discuss today is to understand the important definitions, important provisions, right? And the important aspects of this act, what we need to take into consideration for our future purposes. So first of all, let us focus on some of the important definitions and concepts. Here we need to talk of first such kind of concept. We need to understand the person resident in India. Now, person resident in India is not exactly a person who is staying in India, but as per the FEMA, a person who has resided in India for 182 days during the preceding financial year can be called as a person resident in India. A person who has spent, need to remember this, who has spent 182 days in India, resided in India in the preceding financial year can be called as the person resident in India. But this aspect doesn't include some other aspects, like a person may be a citizen of India, but who has gone out of India or who stays out of India, right, for any purpose, like for taking up an employment, right, or maybe he is staying out of India, gone out of India for carrying out his business or any kind of trade practices, right? And like where it is assumed that the person who stays outside India for an uncertain period of time, right? Even if that particular person has spent 182 days in India but has left India for employment or for carrying out his business, which defines that he is going to leave out of India for any such circumstances, for any such period, right? An uncertain period. So he is not called as a resident in India. Similarly, a person who has come to maybe a non-resident, right? A person who has come to stay in India, maybe any such other person, right? But he has come to India to take up any kind of employment, or he has come to India to carry out certain business, right? Or maybe in such circumstances where its stay in India is not for a certain period of time, is also not called as the resident of India. So we need to understand it clearly that like a person who has spent 182 days in India, but has not moved out of India for employment or for business, or has not moved out of India for uncertain period of time, right? Similarly, any other person out of India who has come to India for employment or for business or has stayed in India for uncertain period of time are not included in the definition. Right? Similarly, a person, or we say that a body, corporate, right, which is registered or incorporated in India, right? So he can be called as a person resident in India. So any such person who has registered or incorporated any such body, right, corporations, right, he can be called as the resident of India. Similarly, any such person who has an office in India or branch or any kind of agency in India who that is entirely owned by the person resident out of India, outside India, so he can also be called as the person resident in India if he has got his branch or agency owned by him or controlled by him completely. Right? Similarly, any such office or branch agency outside India owned by or controlled by a person resident in India can also be called as a person resident in India. Like he may have moved out to control that, but he can be called as a resident. Right? So here we need to understand the very important aspect is to understand that the resident of India means a person who has spent 182 days in India in the preceding financial year, who has registered or incorporated any such body, right, or corporate body, or as a person in India, right, has got his branch, agency, or office outside India, but is a person resident in India. Similarly, a person who is resident out of India, but has got his branch or agency or office in India. These are the persons who can be called as the resident in India. It has nothing to deal with the the citizenship, right? The person who is residing in India, that can be taken into consideration, right? So any other person who is not included in this category, who is not being taken or being considered as the person resident in India, he can be called as a person resident outside India, right? So who is not a resident in India, he can be the person outside India, right? So resident in India and resident outside India, these are the things that we need to take into consideration, because everywhere the applications will be based on that, right? Similarly, other persons, like whenever we to deal with this Foreign Exchange Management Act, we need to talk of this authorized persons, right? Authorized dealers through whom the exchanges can be done, right? They are being authorized by the RBI and the central government of India, right? So we say that an authorized dealer is person who can otherwise be called as a money changer, money exchanger, or any such offshore banking unit, or any such person who are authorized by RBI and the central government of India to deal with any kind of foreign exchanges or any kind of foreign securities. Now, the importance of these authorized persons are that we say that without the consent of these authorized persons, the transactions are not valid, right? And we need to talk of other aspects like a capital account transaction and a current account transaction. Right? We say whenever we talk of these capital account transactions, we focus on transactions which alters the assets or liabilities, including this liabilities, including any kind of contingent liabilities also, right? Outside India of the person resident in India, or assets or liabilities in India of person residents outside India in India. Okay. Whether the person is a resident of India but is altering any kind of assets or liabilities, including these contingent liabilities outside India, it is also called as a capital account transaction. Similarly, any such resident out of India, if the concerned person is altering any kind of assets or liabilities or contingent liabilities in India, it is also coming under the capital account transactions, right? So any alterations made by any such person, either the resident of India making it out of India, or the resident out of India making it in India, right? So that is called as a capital account transaction. Similarly, when we talk of this current account transactions, so here we need to understand that current account transactions do include all other transactions which is not defined under this capital account transactions. Right? So without any kind of prejudices, without any kind of prior judgments, all those aspects of the transactions can be called as the current account transactions, right? So say for example, we are talking of the payment due in connection with this foreign trade or any such kind of current businesses that a person owns, that can be a current account transaction. Any kind of transactions related to the services made thereof, maybe short-term banking or credit facilities, or any such other aspects of the business, or you know related to that particular business itself, that can be covered under these current account transactions. Similarly, payments due as interest on loans or as net income from investments made in some foreign subsidiaries, they can be also covered under these current account transactions. Remittances for living expenses of parents, spouse, children residing abroad can also be the current account transactions. Expenses in terms of foreign travels, education, medical care, like of say, or maybe of the spouse or children, parents, anyone, that can also be covered under these current account transactions. But here we need to talk of that there are certain restrictions imposed by RBI and by the central government of India to carry out all these current account transactions. So we'll gradually discuss all of those aspects related to this capital account transactions and current account transactions, right? So this is one of the important aspects that we need to take into consideration. Similarly, we need to understand the foreign currency, foreign exchange. Foreign currency means any other currency we are referring other than Indian currency. So that is called as a foreign currency. And foreign exchanges means any such foreign currency that is also included in exchanges and includes also in terms of deposits or credits or in terms of balances payable in any foreign currency, that is also being treated as a foreign exchange. Similarly, any kind of drafts, if you talk of traveler's checks, letters of credit or bills of exchange, that is expressed or drawn in Indian currency but is payable in foreign currency, is also a part of foreign exchange. Drawn in favor of Indian currency but payable in foreign currency. Right? Similarly, any kind of drafts, traveler checks, or letter of credit bills which is drawn by banks or institutions or any persons outside India, payable in Indian currency, that is also being treated as a foreign exchange. Right? So foreign exchange includes foreign currency, deposits, credits, balances payable in foreign currency. Again, any kind of draft, traveler's checks, or credit or bills expressed, right, or drawn in favor of Indian currency but is payable in foreign currency, foreign exchanges. Drafts, traveler checks, or credit or bills of exchange drawn by banks or institutions or persons outside India but payable in Indian currency, that is also a foreign exchange. Right? So the definitions include the aspects, like what we need to understand is what we have discussed till now is we need to understand important aspects like who is a person resident in India, who is a person resident out India, right? We need to talk of the authorized persons who are really having the responsibility or through whom all these exchanges can be possible itself, right? To talk of the capital account transactions, we to talk of the current account transactions, right? And the foreign currency and foreign exchange. These are the important aspects, important definitions of this Foreign Exchange Management Act that we need to take into consideration. So going deeper into the aspects of this Foreign Exchange Management Act, we say as I told you that the important aspects of this particular act deals with capital account transactions and current account transactions, right? And similarly, how these properties can be, acquired by the persons resident in India, out of India, and the persons resident out of India in India. We are going to discuss all of those provisions in details to understand the concepts, right? So let us start with this first concept. We say capital account transactions. So whenever we talk of these capital account transactions, actually this was governed by this permissible capital account transactions regulations of 2000. And as we understand that any such kind of transactions that alters the assets or liabilities including contingent liabilities, outside India of a person resident in India, or in India of a person resident outside India is called as capital account transactions. That we need to understand, right? So alterations of assets, liabilities, contingent liabilities by a person resident in India, out of India, or by a person resident out of India, in India, they are called as the capital account transactions. But no, there are certain restrictions being imposed to carry out all these capital account transactions. However, RBI has got the authority to regulate the capital account transactions in India and out of India. But all those rules and regulations can be made in consultation with the central government. So all those capital account transactions are specified, right, with the RBI in consultation with the central government of India, central government website. So they have classified it in terms of the permissible classes of capital account transactions. The maximum limit up to which these foreign exchanges can be admissible for any such kind of transactions, capital account transactions, or any condition which may be placed on such transactions. So these are the restrictions which are to be imposed for carrying out all these capital account transactions, where RBI in consultation with the central government defines it from case to case basis. Certain rules and regulations have already been framed, right? And if at all it is required, then it can be like in consultation with the central government, RBI can define or specify this kind of transactions. So here we need to understand, if we are dealing with this capital account transactions, so whenever we are talking of this capital account transactions, we need to talk of the capital account transactions of persons resident in India and the persons resident out of India. So all these capital account transactions are classified under two categories. There are classes of capital account transactions of the persons resident in India and the persons resident out of India. So here the classifications include like the persons resident in India, if they have invested in any kind of foreign securities, that will be covered under this capital account transactions, right? And if the persons resident in India have any kind of foreign currency loans raised either in India or abroad, that can also be covered under this capital account transactions. Need to understand it, right? So foreign currency loans raised either in India and abroad, wherever it may be. So that can be part of the capital account transactions, right? We say the transfer of immovable property outside India. Right? But we are going to discuss that, how this property can be acquired by these persons resident in India or by the persons resident out of India. Right? Persons resident in India can acquire property out of India, or persons resident out of India can acquire property in India. So those are the things that we are going to discuss in detail. So how this transfer of immovable properties, whatever it may be, right, outside India, that will also be covered under this capital account transactions. The guarantees issued by a person in favor of a person resident outside India, right? The person resident in India in favor of the person resident out India, right? So any kind of guarantees, if that is being issued by the person resident in India, that can also be a part of this capital account transactions. We do talk of any kind of export, import, and holding of currency or currency notes that can also be a part of the capital account transactions. Right? Export, import holdings by the persons resident in India. We are talking of all of these provisions, all of these transactions made by the persons resident in India. Right? Similarly, if we to talk of the remittances outside India of any such capital assets by the persons resident in India, that will also be covered under this class. Right? Similarly, maintenance of these foreign exchanges, foreign currency accounts, right, in India and outside India by the persons resident in India can also be a part of these things. Loans and overdrafts to a particular person resident outside India by the person resident in India can also be a part of this capital account transactions. So here you see all these provisions which are mentioned are dealing with the related transactions made by the persons resident in India, right? And the transactions may happen outside India, or transactions may include the other person who is the person resident out India, right? So similarly, the other aspects of this, what it says that capital account transactions made by the persons resident outside India. The persons who are residing outside India, resident out of India. Now, what are the things that will cover under this class of capital account transactions? This is that any kind of investments made in India by the persons resident outside India will be covered under this. Similarly, if we to talk of, like as I was telling you, that the acquisition and transfer of immovable property in India, that can also be included under this capital account transactions. We do talk of the guarantee in favor of or on behalf of a person resident in India made by a person resident outside India can also be covered under this. Export and import of currency notes into or from India made by the persons resident outside India, that can also be covered under that. Right? Deposits between a person resident in India and a person resident outside India. Any such kind of deposits we talk of, right? That will also be covered under that. Foreign currency accounts in India of a person resident outside India. Foreign currency account in India, right? Can be covered under this. Remittances outside India of capital assets in India of a person resident out of India. All of these can be covered under this capital account transactions. So when we talk of this capital account transactions itself, right? What we say that it is the alteration of the assets, liabilities, including all such kind of contingent liabilities between the person resident in India, outside India, or when the person resident out of India, in India, will be covered under this capital account transactions. Okay? So these are the classifications of all of those different aspects of the capital account transactions for the persons resident in India and the persons resident outside India can be dealt in details. Okay? Hope as of now you are clear related to this capital account transactions. Just in a very simpler note, if you do make it. So it includes all such kind of alterations of the assets and liabilities and contingent liabilities, right? So all of those things can be covered under this capital account transactions. Clear? Now, the other aspect of this is the current account transactions. As we have already discussed it earlier, that the current account transactions are the transactions which are beyond this capital account transactions, which is not a capital account transaction, is called as a current account transactions. We need to understand that. Right? So mostly, whenever we talk of these transactions related to any kind of foreign trade, right, or the current business, services, short-term banking, credit facilities, all of these are related to the current account transactions that you need to understand. Okay. Similarly, whenever you talk of any kind of payment that you make, right, or that is due as an interest on the loans or as a net income from your investment, that will also be covered under this, current account transactions. Sometimes you go for these remittances for living expenses of your parents, spouse, children residing abroad, right? So in that case, any kind of transactions that you do make will also be covered under this current account transactions. And expenses in connection with the foreign travel, maybe education, medical care of parents, spouse, children, all of those transactions can also be a part of the current account transactions, right? Just a minute. So here we need to understand that any such kind of transaction that we are making in related to the foreign trade or business, that will be covered under this current account transactions. But to talk of like any kind of services or banking or credit facilities, that will also be a part of that. Interest or loans or incomes from the investments, right? That will be a part of that. And remittances for this, for the livelihood of your parents, spouse, children residing abroad, maybe in connection with their travel, education, medical facilities, whatever it may be, right? So here you need to understand, like for deeper understanding of this current account transactions, you need to go through this Schedule 1, Schedule 2, Schedule 3 of this Foreign Exchange Management Act, where it says that certain transactions are prohibited. Under this current account transaction, certain transactions are prohibited. Like list of the transactions which are prohibited by RBI or by Central Government of India are being mentioned over here. You have to go through the Schedule 1 for the details of all those transactions which are prohibited under current account transactions. Similarly, certain transactions which require the prior approval of the central government are mentioned under the Schedule 2 of the Act, right? So, like we have understood, like certain remittances, like your livelihood expenses of parents, spouse, or children, or maybe foreign travel, education, medical, that needs to be approved by the central government. So the list mentioned, like the various authorities from whom you need to have the approval, prior approval, right? So before carrying out any such kind of current account transactions, these prior approvals are required. That is what we need to understand. Similarly, Schedule 3 of the Act, Schedule 3 of the Act mentions the transactions which require prior approval of RBI, Reserve Bank of India. Right? So, certain restrictions, with certain prior approvals, all these transactions are to be regularized. Right? So these are the things that we need to understand whenever we are talking of this capital account transactions or current account transactions, we need to understand it in detail with all those kind of provisions, with all those kind of restrictions or prior approval requirements, so that we can carry out. The objective is to regularize the business. Objective is to regularize the trade and practices, so that no such ambiguity, no such confusions should emerge in between. So all those transactions made under this Foreign Exchange Management Act are classified under two categories. Just to revise, one is called as a capital account transaction, the current account transaction. Capital account transaction, where you do have the alterations of any kind of assets, liabilities, or contingent liabilities between the person resident in India, out of India, or between the person resident out of India. Excluding all those transactions which are covered under capital account transactions, the rest of the transactions are covered under current account transactions, which basically focuses on whenever you are carrying out any such kind of trade or business, right? Or maybe you are dealing with any such kind of services, maybe short-term, long-term banking, or credit facilities. So all those kinds of transactions will be covered under this current account transactions. And similarly, any kind of remittances that you do make for the livelihood of your parents, spouse, children out of India, or the travel, education, health of those parents, spouse, children. So all of those will be covered. So I believe up to now you are clear related to this aspects of this transactions made under the Act, right? Capital account transactions and current account transactions. Now, one of the important aspects of this capital account transaction, where we have understood, okay, there is the alterations of assets, liabilities, and contingent liabilities between the person resident in India, out of India, or resident out of India in India. So under that, we need to talk of there are certain provisions related to acquiring property in and outside India by the person resident outside India or the person resident in India. So these are the aspects that we need to take into consideration for details, right? So let us first talk of this acquisition and transfer of this immovable property in India by a person resident outside India, right? Or by a person resident in India, right? Here we need to talk. So a person resident outside India who is a citizen of India, right? He can acquire any such kind of immovable property in India, but other than excluding the agricultural land, the land used for plantation purposes or farmhouses, right? He can acquire any such immovable property other than this agricultural land, plantations, and farmhouses, right? But subject to a condition that he can transfer this immovable property in India to a person resident in India first, right? And then he can transfer any such immovable property other than this agricultural plantation property or farmhouses to a person resident outside India, right? And these assets are sold after 3 years, right? And the amount equivalent to that foreign exchange can be repatriated. You need to understand the process. So the person resident outside India can acquire any such property, any such immovable property other than agricultural land, plantation land, or farmhouses. But you need to transfer these immovable properties in India to a person resident in India first. Directly he cannot acquire it, right? So he can transfer all his immovable properties, right, to a person resident out of India. But this transactions can happen, the like alterations of these properties can happen only after 3 years of such assets sold, right? And the amount equivalent can be repatriated, right, to that foreign exchanges. Clear? So we need to understand that, okay, there are certain restrictions made or imposed for agriculture, plantation land, or farmhouses. Other than that, the person resident out of India can acquire any such immovable property. But first, you need to transfer that property to a person resident in India. Then that property can be transferred to the person resident out of India. Assets can be sold after 3 years, right? So this is how the immovable property can be acquired by a person resident outside India. Now, if we talk of the second category, we're talking of the person of Indian origin, PIO. We say. So how this properties can be acquired or transferred by a person of Indian origin, right? Whenever we talk of a person of Indian origin but resident outside India, right, may acquire all those properties other than that agriculture, plant or farm, whatever it may be, right, by the way of the funds received in India by the way of inward remittances, right? Say he can acquire all those property by gift inheritances. Okay? So he can acquire it in terms of certain gift. It can also be transferred to any such person who is a citizen of India, and the assets can be sold after 3 years time duration. The amount equivalent can be exchanged, right? So here the basic difference is that person of Indian origin can acquire it by a gift, right, in terms of a gift. Then after that, that can be transferred to a person citizen of India, and after that it can be sold after 3 years of time, right? So the person not of Indian origin, you need to transfer it to a person of Indian origin first, right, as we have understood it in the previous slide, right? So resident of India, then from resident of India to resident out of India, after that it can be sold 3 years time. Here person of Indian origin can acquire the property by the mode of a gift, and then it can be transferred to any such citizen of India, and after that the property can be sold. Okay? Hope this has cleared the basic aspects of the the transfer of immovable property by any such person resident out of India and by the person of Indian origin, right? Here we are talking of the acquisition of immovable property for carrying on the business itself. That is what we need to understand. So if a person is a resident out of India who has established any such branch or a place of business in India and has done that in accordance with the RBI regulations, the person can acquire any such immovable property, right, to carry out such kind of businesses, subject to condition that whatever property the person has acquired, right, that should be filed with the RBI declaration within 90 days. Right? So any such person acquiring that property should file with the RBI declaration from that NRI within that period of 90 days. So if you carry out certain, if you like to acquire certain property to carry out your businesses or to start your uh, new branches, new subsidiaries in India. So as per RBI regulations, or if it has got the RBI clearances itself, if you are acquiring any such property, that has to be filed with RBI within 90 days time, right? The property can be transferred by the way of mortgages to that authorized dealer. Here I told now there are certain persons who do have the authority to carry out all those kind of transactions or exchanges itself, authorized persons, right? Authorized dealers. So all those properties can be transferred by the way of mortgages to the authorized dealers, right? As a security for any kind of borrowings if you do have. And then the asset is sold, right? And the sale proceeds can be repatriated only with the prior permission of RBI. So RBI has got all those authorities to look into the aspects of the sale proceeds which can be repatriated. Hope you have understood the basic aspects of that, properties or how it can be transferred, right, by any such person resident out of India, person of Indian origin, and if any such person resident outside India is acquiring any kind of property for carrying out the business or for carrying out any such kind of business here in India, so that can be taken into consideration, right? And towards the end, we need to talk of acquisition and transfer of immovable property outside India by a person resident in India, right? So how a person resident in India can acquire a property outside India, that is what we need to understand the basic processes. So a person resident in India can acquire or transfer any kind of immovable property outside India with that following conditions. Like the first is that there is no such restrictions applied to any kind of property held by any such person resident in India who is a national of any foreign state but acquired that property on or before 1947 and had inherited it from the person who was a resident outside India. Okay. So if you do have certain property, like we are talking of immovable property situated outside India, right? So if you do have certain property, you're a resident out of India person, right? But you have acquired that particular property before 1947 and that particular property had been inherited from the persons who was that resident outside India. So the restrictions are not applied to that particular property. Right? However, if the person is a resident in India, can acquire that immovable property outside India by the way of gift or inheritance from the person resident in India. So it has to be like if you want to, acquire certain property outside India, so that property has to be, transferred to a particular person resident in India, and then can be transferred as a gift or inherited from that particular person. Similarly, if a person resident in India also acquires the property outside India by the way of purchase out of foreign exchanges, right? So you need to have that RFC account, right, maintained for that particular purpose. So what you need to do is to follow those rules and regulations as being imposed by RBI for that particular purchase out of foreign exchanges, right? Similarly, we do talk of this for person resident in India has to acquire immovable property outside India. So he may transfer it by the way of gift to his relatives or who is a person resident in India, right? So excluding this, like ways by which a person can acquire any such kind of property, out of India. Other cases your special permissions of RBI is required. Okay? Otherwise, with these conditions, like if you're acquiring property as a way of gift or as inherited from the person's resident in India, it's okay, right? Or you want to purchase out through that foreign exchanges, so you know RBI rules and regulations are to be followed like that. So what we need to understand is that the basic aspects of this foreign exchange management act, as we say, is more important in terms of transactions related to the capital account, right? Transactions related to capital account, what it says, that any kind of alterations of the property, right? Assets or liabilities, contingent liabilities. We have understood four different ways of carrying out of that. First of all, we have understood like that any such property can be acquired by any such person resident out of India, then in India, where the property has to be, first the property has to be transferred to the person resident in India, right? And that will exclude all those kind of agricultural farmland, right? Or land used for the purpose of plantations, right? And after that, that property can be transferred to the person outside India, and the property can be sold after 3 years time. Okay. Similarly, if we talk of the like acquiring of the property by person of Indian origin, so no such restrictions are applied to any such property which has been acquired before 1947, right? So we need to understand that all those persons of Indian origin can also acquire all those properties, right, by the way of gift or inheritances, right? Or then that property has to be transferred to any such person who is a citizen of India, and from that, those assets can be sold after 3 years time, and as we have understood that the amount equivalent to that foreign exchange can be repatriated. Third, we have understood that any such person who would like to acquire the immovable property to carry out his business, right, in India. So if the person has established any such branch in India or has established any such business in India with the rules and regulations of RBI, can acquire any such property to be used or to carry out such business activities or branch activities. But you have to understand that the person has to file it with RBI declaration, right? After this acquiring this property within 90 days, the the person has to file it with RBI declarations, right? Similarly, it can be transferred by the way of mortgages through any such authorized dealer, right? And the role of these authorized dealers are important over here. And the sale proceeds can be repatriated with prior permission of RBI. All of those aspects are controlled and regulated by RBI itself. And towards the end, as we have understood that the transfer of immovable property outside India by the resident of India, we have understood it that restrictions are not imposed on the properties which has been acquired on or before 1947, but it can also be taken into consideration where the property has been inherited from the person who was a resident outside India, right? Have been acquired before 1947. So all those properties can be acquired outside India through the gifts and inheritances from the person resident in India, right? And if you'd like to purchase it out, so you can purchase it out of certain foreign exchanges as per the RBI rules and regulations, right? Person resident in India can acquire also immovable property outside India, where you can transfer it by the way of gift to his relatives or to the person resident in. All other aspects of the transfer of these properties in India can be taken into consideration, right? So like that only it can be considered, right? But as if we have understood that the basic aspects of the Act, Foreign Exchange Management Act, deals with certain other provisions like you know uh, who can be an authorized person, like so we need to go in detail for those kind of aspects, like there are certain penalties being imposed for non-compliances with the provisions of the act, or penalties being imposed, right, for violating the rules and regulations of the act, right? We do talk of the adjudication offences, we do talk of all those appeals or provisions against those kind of things, right? So somehow rather we need to understand that all of those kind of transformations that we have witnessed from the earlier versions of the act, like Foreign Exchange Regulation Act to Foreign Exchange Management Act, is to provide more, flexibility for having transactions within India by the persons resident out of India, or by the persons resident in India outside India. Now, prior to that, during this FERA, Foreign Exchange Regulation Act, utmost authority was given to RBI. RBI was treated to be the sole controller of business in India, where all those aspects of rules and regulations are entirely being controlled by RBI itself. So there were many such taxes, duties, levies imposed on the export and import of assets, right, liabilities itself. But those are being removed, and a flexible approach has been undertaken by RBI and the central government of India itself, making it more convenient, more easier to carry out the businesses in India itself. So, Foreign Exchange Management Act is to regulate, as we have understood. No, the basic objective of the act is to regulate any such kind of foreign exchanges itself, and objective is to facilitate the external trade and practices, the payments, exchange of payments, right, within in India by the residents out of India or outside India by the residents in India. So helping all those aspects, transforming all those aspects to regulate all those foreign exchange market in India. So these are the aspects related to the Foreign Exchange Management Act 1999. So let us wind it over here, and as we continue with this session, MMPC 13, this is Unit A, and please join us for the next session. Thank you very much.